Good evening, and welcome to the rest of Hitler's Revolution, Chapter 3. Let me initiate the offline recording, and we're going to continue where we left off after I verify that the stream is up and running. Just a moment here. Okay, we're live, and making sure we've got audio. Okay, let's verify. Just a moment here. Yep, it's working. Okay, good. Let's begin. Let me turn on my offline recording here, starting recording. So there's a high quality version of this that I'm recording offline with a good Yeti microphone. I think we've addressed the echo issue. Please confirm that the audio is good. Okay. So I think the audio is good here. We're live. Good. And the audio was good. Okay, sound is good. Proceeding with the book. So we left off with the Newton telegrams back to England. So we're continuing on here. England and France, Newton continued, cannot prevent Czechoslovakia from being overrun. At most, they can wage war to restore the status quo that is already proving unworkable. He concluded that no German government will accept a hostile Czechoslovakia. He concluded that no German government will accept a hostile Czechoslovakia on their flank. Having read Newton's report, the British ambassador in Berlin, Henderson, cabled his ministry on May 17th, quote, I share unreservedly in all respects views expressed by Mr. Newton in his telegram. End quote. The Cabinet Committee on Foreign Policy discussed Newton's analysis the following day. As its minutes record, quote, the Minister for Coordination of Defense said that he had been struck by Mr. Newton's view that Czechoslovakia's present political position was not permanently tenable and that she was, in fact, an unstable unit in Central Europe. What if, as he believed, this truly represented the position, he could see no reason why we should take any steps to maintain such a unit in being, end quote. So Czechoslovakia was a globalist created state designed to be a diverse state where no one could pursue their national interest, and the Germans were being oppressed. The French, the Americans, everyone involved admitted this. So we are back, and I see someone saying, anyhow, I will not be watching the chat. I'm closing the window. I will not censor. If you feel anyone is doing anything illegal, report it to the police. Do not ask me to censor the chat. I don't have time. I'm busy reading. Continuing on. On March 21st, the Chiefs of Staff submitted a report to the committee explaining that the British and French armies were too weak to go to war against Germany, Italy, and Japan in an expanding conflict over Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain and Halifax considered the military assessment, quote, an extremely melancholy document, end quote. Halifax summarized on April 27th, quote, neither we nor France were equipped for a war with Germany, end quote. France's new Prime Minister, Edward Daladier, visited London on April 28th to persuade Chamberlain to publicly guarantee English protection for Czechoslovakia. His British colleague retorted that Beneš, and remember, Beneš is the leader of Czechoslovakia at the time, which was being propped up by the Soviet Union, and he was having the Soviets amass an army in Czechoslovakia. He was preparing forward air bases for attacking Germany with. Beneš was essentially going to be the route through which the Soviet army invaded Germany, as the Soviets, controlled by Jews, tried to invade Germany in 1920, 1921, and 1922, where the Polish aristocracy actually stopped the Jewish army from coming across from the Soviet Union in the war between the Soviet Union and Poland in the early 20s. Moving on. His British colleague retorted that Beneš has never treated the German minority in the territories he annexed in a liberal manner as promised. Chamberlain declared that the people of England would never begin a war to prevent the nationalities of Central Europe from expressing their will in a plebiscite. So basically, here the Jews are trying, and Chamberlain was not liked by the Jews. If you read books by Churchill and stuff, Churchill was bought and paid for by the Jews and also had Jewish ancestry. And he hated Chamberlain because Chamberlain embraced the will of the English people as well as the wills of the other peoples of the people that he interfaced with. And this is why Chamberlain was publicly lynched from office by the Jewish-controlled press of the UK. So Chamberlain declared that the people of England would never begin a war to prevent the nationalities of Central Europe from expressing their will in a plebiscite. Plebiscite's pretty much another word for a referendum. That month, Hitler ordered General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces Supreme Command, the OKV, OKV, OKW. Jeez, my German's getting bad. Sorry. That month, Hitler ordered General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces Supreme Command, OKV, the OKW, to prepare a study on the possible invasion of Czechoslovakia. He told Keitel that he did not, at present, intend to invade. Guidelines Hitler furnished to the OKW emphasized that he would reject any scenario proposing a, quote, strategic surprise attack out of the clear sky without grounds or possibility of justification, end quote. The Führer described, quote, an untenable situation for us should the major confrontation in the East, with Bolshevism ever come, Czechoslovakia would then be a springboard for the Red Army and a landing place for its Air Force, end quote. And if you remember from earlier in the chapter, the Red Army was already preparing forward air bases in the border regions with Germany of Czechoslovakia. So they were already preparing to invade Germany. And once again, this offensive posture against Germany was repeated in 1940-1941 when the Soviets were led by an 85% Jewish government were getting ready to invade Germany across the Polish frontier. Moving on. On May 20th, Beneš called up over 150,000 military reservists to active duty. Beneš being the leader of Czechoslovakia at the time that was supported by international Jewry, claiming that the measure was necessary because of a secret mobilization of the German armed forces. The Czech War Office charged that 8 to 10 German divisions were marching toward the common frontier. The French military attaché in Berlin cabled his government that he saw no evidence of larger troop movements. Henderson sent two British Army officers on his Berlin embassy staff on an extensive reconnaissance through the German border provinces of Saxony and Silesia. He wrote later, quote, they could discover no sign of unusual or significant German military activity, nor indeed could any of the military attachés of the foreign missions in Berlin who were similarly engaged in scouring the country. End quote. So Henderson reports back, yeah, the Germans are not preparing to invade. Hitler more or less ignored Beneš's provocation and took no action, military or otherwise. Journalists in Paris, Prague, London, and New York accepted Beneš's spurious allegations about German troop deployments. They published stories about how the Führer had massed his divisions to bluff the Czechs into submitting to his demands. When Beneš defiantly countered with his own partial mobilization, Hitler supposedly, air quotes, backed down and recalled his formations, a profound humiliation for a dictator who was, quote, incapable of acting on his own threats. His declarations regarding the Sudetenland were nothing but hot air. So this is a Jewish press lying and trying to humiliate the Germans. Halifax warned Herbert von Dirksen, the German ambassador in London, that a Czech-German war would bring France and Britain into the conflict against the Reich. The Foreign Secretary then composed a personal letter to Ribbentrop, admonishing him of the hazards of any, air quotes, rash actions would lead to for European civilization. Henderson recorded, quote, what Hitler could not stomach was the exultation of the press. Every newspaper in Europe and America joined in the chorus. No had been said, and Hitler had been forced to yield. The democratic powers had brought the totalitarian states to heel, etc. End quote. The British conducted partial mobilization of their fleet, and the French garrisoned their fortifications along the German border, even though both knew that their Czech ally had instigated the crisis. For Hitler, threats and accusations of cowardice were his reward for the forbearance he had exercised. So basically, Hitler sought peace, refused to mobilize his army, and then the Judenpresse said that he had mobilized his army, but then backed down because his bluff had been called. So it's just Jews spinning narratives. This is exactly how the Jews got us into Iraq. This is how hundreds of thousands of our people wound up getting deployed to secure the greater realm for Israel. Jewish lies. Moving on. The May crisis impressed Hitler with how hostile the Western democracies in Czechoslovakia were toward Germany. Even the USSR had publicly reaffirmed its military obligation to the Czechs. He concluded that a peaceful settlement of the Sudeten issue was unlikely. On May 30th, he revised the earlier Armed Forces Directive addressing potential war with the Czechs to begin with the sentence, quote, "It is my unalterable resolve to smash Czechoslovakia through a military action in the foreseeable future," end quote. The document stressed that, quote, "preparations are to be implemented without delay," end quote. So, in other words, Hitler knows he's being baited into a war, so let's get ready. After the May crisis, there's a picture here that shows Hitler with some of his general staff, and it says, after the May crisis, Hitler ordered the construction of fortifications to defend the border with France. Inspecting the Westwall are left to right Erhard Milch, Heinrich Himmler, Wilhelm Keitel, Himmler's adjutant Karl Wolff, and the Führer. And this is from the Bundesarchiv. Historians present this statement as proof of Hitler's warlike intentions. Yet just 18 days later, he revised the classified directive, deleting the sentence about the resolve to smash the Czechs. He stated instead that the, quote, solution of the Czech question was the near-term objective, end quote. There is little evidence here of a clear intent to wage war. Henderson wrote Halifax, quote, "It stands to reason that Hitler himself must equally be prepared for all eventualities. But from there to say that he has already decided on aggressive action against Czechoslovakia this autumn is, I think, untrue," end quote. The British ambassador wrote again in August, quote, "But I do not believe he wants war," end quote. In his own memoirs, Henderson later reflected on the May crisis. "When we were thinking only that Germany was on the point of attacking the Czechs, the Germans were apprehensive lest the latter meant to provoke a European war before they themselves were ready for it," end quote. Hitler still possessed a diplomatic trump: democracy's own arguments about human rights. The Führer publicly stated, quote, "What the Germans insist on is the right to self-determination that every other nation also possesses. I demand that the oppression of the 3.5 million Germans in Czechoslovakia stop, and that in its place the free right to self-determination step in," end quote. So this is what the Jews will never let people have, the right to self-determination. They're always going to set up a quote-unquote democracy where the Jews rig all of the elections and support outright dictators when they can't rig elections to get what they want. This was the Achilles heel of his adversaries. Henderson confessed, quote, "On the broadest moral grounds, it was thus difficult to justify offhand the refusal of the right to self-determination to the 2,750,000 Sudetens living in solid blocks just across Germany's border. Its flat denial would have been contrary to a principle on which the British Empire itself was founded, and would consequently never have rallied to us the wholehearted support either of the British people or that of the Empire," end quote. The permanent Undersecretary for the Foreign Office, Alexander Cadogan, concluded that the Sudeten problem, quote, "was not an issue on which we should be on very strong ground for plunging Europe into war," end quote. In other words, the British Foreign Office is admitting, yeah, this is ridiculous. There's no way that the Jew press can roll this for us to make it look like we're in the right if we cause war with Germany over, making sure that those 3.5 million Germans continue to get, completely oppressed. So Chamberlain assessed England's position. His country had not yet sufficiently rearmed to honor the commitment to support France in the event of war. So it looks like England was a lot more willing to disarm than France was, and this is arguably because the Jews needed France to be more gung-ho for the war. It was easier to stoke up anti-German sentiments because that the First World War, you remember, was fought mostly on French soil, and that left scars on the land that are visible to this day. And we'll cover that another time when I read Henry Ford's The International Jew, which will take me about 2 weeks, but we'll do that later. To allow Hitler a free hand to settle accounts with Beneš, the leader of Czechoslovakia, would have marred British esteem abroad. Quote, "We shall be despised forever," end quote, ventured Halifax's secretary, Sir Oliver Harvey. A plebiscite for the Sudetenland also had pitfalls. Prague opposed the idea because the precedent would encourage the Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, and Lithuanians to demand one as well, since these minorities suffered under representation in government and from oppression, they would likely dissolve Czechoslovakia. And so here you see the right to self-determination must not be encouraged. This is much like Brexit. The Jews didn't want that vote to take place, and now that it has taken place, they're trying to discredit the vote, and now that they can't discredit the vote for Brexit, they're trying to just undermine it and make it so, in effect, Brexit never happens. Jews will never let you have your way with a plebiscite or with a referendum, just like gay marriage here in California, where the people overwhelmingly voted to make it so that butt pirates couldn't call each other husband and husband. The Jews will make sure that the will of the people is subverted, and that's why Jews must be removed from power. Whether you're trying to secure the right to a moral society, to legislate morality and uphold good, virtuous values in your society through the law and through the judicial system, or whether you just want to keep your country out of a war that the Jews want you to get into, Jews must be removed from all facets of power in your country if you wish not to be subverted. For the will of the people to be carried out, you must remove Jews from your government and cultural institutions, period. Moving on. Daladier proposed a compromise. Czechoslovakia would cede the Sudetenland to Germany without conducting a plebiscite. So, in other words, yeah, we're going to do what the plebiscite would have happen, which is then joining, leaving this multi-culti country that the Jews tried to create. But we're not going to have them use a plebiscite to do it, or referendum, because then other people would want referendums too, and we can't have other people's wanting the rights to determine their own future. No, we need globalism, goy. So we can't keep global homo in this case, but we're going to make sure that no one else gets the idea that they can have self-determination. God, these Jews are so tyrannical. Moving on. In this way, the Czech state would remain reasonably intact. Its importance to France, as Daladier explained to Chamberlain, was that, quote, "In any military operation, there are wonderful possibilities for attacking Germany from Czechoslovak territory," end quote. French aviation minister Pierre Cot echoed this attitude with a remark quoted in London's News Chronicle of July 1st, 1938. Cot stated that France and England needed Czechoslovakia, quote, "because from this state, the German economy and the German industry are most easily to be destroyed with bombs. Joint attacks of the French and Czech air forces can very quickly destroy all German production facilities," end quote. So here is the Jew-controlled French government trying to maintain an offensive war footing by keeping Czechoslovakia as a multi-culti state protruding into the interior of Germany so that they could bomb German cities. In August, Chamberlain proposed traveling to Germany to meet with Hitler to settle the Sudeten question together. He elicited a promise from his host that Germany would take no military action during the negotiations. Czech Foreign Minister Kamil Krafta told the British and French governments that his country refused to cede the Sudetenland to Germany. And remember, the Sudetenland was 90% German, or 85% German, and it was part of the German part of German Austria prior to the Treaty of Versailles. London countered bluntly, quote, The Franco-British plan is the only means of preventing the threat of a German attack," end quote. and that if Prague rejects it, England and France will not intervene if Germany invades Czechoslovakia. On September 21st, Beneš unconditionally acquiesced to the proposal. During September, Chamberlain visited Germany 3 times. The first meeting with Hitler took place in Berchtesgaden on September 15th. The session was cordial and constructive. Chamberlain approved Hitler's proposals for the Sudeten areas to be annexed. Halifax wrote his ambassadors, quote, "In fact, it corresponded very closely to the line we have been examining," end quote. Chamberlain spent the following week in meetings with Daladier and the Czechs to obtain their consent. In Berlin, the German monitoring station in the Ministry of Aviation eavesdropped on a telephone conversation between Beneš and French colonial minister George Mandel. Mandel's a German name, by the way. Undermining Daladier, Mandel told Beneš, "Paris and London have no right to dictate your attitude to you. If your territory is violated, you should not wait a second to issue orders to your army to defend the homeland." This is my Jew voice. My Jew voice. "If you fire the first shot in self-defense, the cannons of France, Great Britain, and also Soviet Russia will begin firing on their own," end quote. So this is a Jew in the British government trying to encourage the Czechs to start a war so that the German economic miracle of Jew bank-free economy could be smashed. Anyhow, the Germans also intercepted communications between Prague and its London-Paris embassies. The Beneš government had instructed them to stall for time until the war parties in England and France toppled Chamberlain and Daladier. Wow. So the Jew-controlled government of Czechoslovakia was sending cables to different countries saying, hey, let's make sure these pro-war people, these war hawks that the Jews own, like Churchill, get to become prime minister and stuff, so we can more quickly get to war with Germany. This is insane. This is what the Jews don't want you to know. And just wait until I read you 200 Years Together. I'm going to be reading that and Henry Ford's The International Jew. I don't have the money to travel like I used to be able to. So I'm going to be reading you books with commentary. Moving on. On September 22nd, Hitler conferred with Chamberlain at the Hotel Driesen in Bad Godesberg. Reports of mounting unrest in the Sudetenland clouded the atmosphere. Heinlein had formed an ethnic German militia, numbering nearly 40,000 men, which skirmished with Czech soldiers and police. The Czech government correspondingly implemented more repressive measures. In 14 days, 120,000 Sudeten Germans crossed into the Reich to escape the violence. Heinlein appealed to Hitler to send in the German army, quote, to put an end to any more murders resulting from Czech fanaticism, end quote. At Bad Godesberg, the Führer demanded the right to militarily occupy the territory to be annexed in 4 days. He cited mounting turmoil there as justification. Chamberlain was taken aback. Bitter haggling followed. The tension pervaded the next night's conference until an orderly interrupted with news that Beneš had just declared general mobilization. Another 1.2 million Czech reservists were returning to active duty. Hitler thereupon reassured his English guests that he would keep his promise to withhold any military response, quote, despite this unheard-of provocation, end quote. This relaxed the atmosphere, and the discussion assumed a friendlier tone. So if Chamberlain had stayed Prime Minister of Great Britain and the Jews hadn't been able to install Churchill, World War II either wouldn't have happened or there would have been a peace reached in 1940 or 1941. In the days following the conference, Chamberlain negotiated with the Czechs. The British and French diplomats ultimately prevailed upon Hitler to relax his additional demands. Göring showed Henderson transcripts of the telephone dialogues between Beneš and Jan Marziak, illuminating the Czech intrigues. Neither the British nor the French doubted their authenticity. At Munich, on September 28th, Chamberlain, Hitler, Daladier, and Mussolini finalized details of the annexation of the Sudetenland, which Prague had agreed to on the 21st. Angry with Chamberlain, Jan Marziak could only bluster, quote, What bad luck! This stupid, badly informed person is the British Prime Minister, end quote. French Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet praised Hitler for softening his Godesberg terms. The Führer also reaped on accolade in the London Times on October 2nd for his concessions and for reducing military measures to, quote, solely a symbolic partial occupation, end quote. Choosing exile in London, Beneš later told an associate, quote, we need a war, and I did everything to bring up the war on, end quote. So this was just like Austria. They tried to make it the cause for war. This is going to happen another few times before the Jews actually get their war. Once Beneš was gone, Germany attempted to improve relations with Prague. There remained 378,000 ethnic Germans in portions of Bohemia, Moravia, not yet annexed by the Reich. Hitler ordered on October 3rd that this minority, while nurturing its cultural heritage, was to relinquish political activity toward autonomy or returning to its lands to German sovereignty. He met with the new Czech foreign minister František Ševlavský on the 14th. Hitler urged him to help, quote, normalize relations in a friendly way. In November, the legal department of the German Foreign Office submitted a draft for a Czech-German friendship treaty. Though Hitler postponed the matter until January 1939, the initiative indicates his interest in working with Prague. His first gesture to the new regime was a generous policy toward Czech residents of the annexed Sudetenland. There were 743,000 of them who initially came under German dominion. 260,000 Czech soldiers, civil servants, and their families returned to Czech territory under orders from their government. Another 160,000, not wishing to live under German jurisdiction, migrated voluntarily. And here's a picture of Hitler with some young people in Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, which is a part of Germany historically. And it says, young well-wishers greet Hitler during his tour of the Sudetenland in October 1938. By the way, all of this land was ethnically cleansed of Germans after World War II, along with many other provinces. A treaty the two states ratified on November 20th permitted Czechs and Slovaks remaining in the Sudetenland to choose their citizenship. Men at least 28 years of age, together with their wives and children, received German citizenship upon request. The Reich's government allowed people opting to remain Czechoslovak nationals to stay on as guest residents. People leaving the Sudeten territory retained ownership of private property there with the option to sell or rent it. Under the treaty's provisions, the German and Czech government respectively could expel foreigners considered at apolitical risk. Out of more than 300,000 Czechs choosing to continue to live in the Sudetenland, the Germans deported just 140 people. So out of 300,000, the Germans only deported 140, and these were probably Jew communists. Hitler exempted Czechs and Slovaks absorbed into the Reich from service in its armed forces, so they got the benefits of joining the German Empire without having to risk conscription. This is amazing. They got a great deal. And even if they chose to leave, they got to keep their property. So this was not an invasion, not a land grab. This was Hitler just liberating ethnic Germans. This was an 85-90% ethnic German area where they were being screwed with reverse discrimination, much as whites are now all over the world by Jewish-controlled governments and institutions. The ethnic German minority residing in Prague-controlled sections of Bohemia, Moravia experienced the resentment of the Czechs after their defeat at Munich. Thousands of Germans lost their jobs. Many were unnecessarily watched by the police. The government denied them and their families unemployment benefits. Czech health insurance companies refused claims for the German University Clinic in Prague. Hitler confronted Ševlavský on January 21, 1939, with a list of grievances resulting from what he called lingering Beneš mentality throughout the Republic. Citing the hostile tone of the Czech press, the Führer warned that no great power can tolerate a smaller neighboring country representing a perpetual threat in its flank. He stressed once more the necessity of improving relations. Ribbentrop read Shevlovsky passages from prominent Czech newspapers. One predicted, quote, 4 months after Munich, it is already clear that a war is unavoidable, end quote. Another read, quote, the momentary political situation will not be regarded as unchangeable and a permanent circumstance, end quote. Henderson advised Wojtek Masny, the Czech ambassador in Berlin, to urge his government to avoid abuse of its ethnic German residents. In exile in London, Beneš sought to maintain political influence through his contacts in Prague. His followers there conducted a press campaign criticizing the present regime for compliance toward Berlin. So here, the Czech government at times looks to be peaceful with Germany, and the Jewish press starts foaming at the mouth. And at the same time, the press urges on with all of this ethnic rage against the ethnic Germans, trying to provoke the Germans to come into to the Czech state. So here it is, the Jewish press trying to start a war, as always, and when the Czechoslovakians put in a new leader that wasn't a rabid warmonger, the Jewish press tried to undermine him and still continue to press for war. I'm going to take a brief break. I'm going to leave you with some good music. I hope you enjoy some of this music. What am I going to do here? Let me pause the recording here, and we'll give you your music while you're waiting for me to come back. Come on. By the way, this will all be available as a complete audiobook without any of these breaks. I'm going to edit it for us. Now let's go with an old favorite.
In
Okay, I'm back. We're going to continue on here. Turn on my recording. And we're back in business. Citing the hostile tone of the Czech press, the Führer warned that no great power can tolerate a smaller neighboring country representing a perpetual threat in its flank. He stressed once more that the necessity of improving relations. Oh yeah, we already did that, so I'm skipping ahead here. None of the rivalries in this political constellation would matter long. The Munich Accord, engineered by the Western democracies to save Czechoslovakia, was ironically her death sentence. Its precedent for self-determination, oh God, Goy, we can't have that, encouraged the country's other most captive minorities to follow the example of the Sudeten Germans. Most prominent among them were the Slovaks. The Czech army and militia had occupied their land in 1919. Thomas Marziak failed to deliver on his promise of regional autonomy, nor were Slovaks equally represented in the public administration. Of 8,000 civil servants in Prague's government offices, just 200 were Slovak. Hitler wished to remain neutral in the friction dividing Czechs and Slovaks. On November 19th, the Reich's Foreign Office directed its mission in Prague to watch events with reserve. The German press received instructions to maintain a non-partisan attitude in reporting on tensions in Slovakia. Hitler ordered, quote, "For the time being, no political talks with the Slovaks are opportune," end quote. So basically, this is how important it is not to have Jews in charge of your media. Not only can they not be in charge of your government, they can't be in charge of your media because they try and start wars. And Hitler needed his press to not try to be sympathetic to the Slovaks because it would be seen as a provocation with the Czechs. So this is when it's very opportune not to have a warmongering Jewish press like we've got in this country and the Western democracies all have in Europe to get them into a war to expand Israel time after time. Moving on, Prague lost its grip on the disaffected minorities. In October, the Slovaks and Ruthenians established regional parliaments, a right finally conceded by the central government as a step toward autonomy. So basically, the people wanted autonomy, they didn't want to be part of a multi-culti state, and the people asserted themselves and set up their own parliaments, peacefully. This is what the Jews don't want. They want it to come to war, so that peaceful establishment of autonomous rule and self-rule for peoples can be smashed. Okay, moving on. Delegates used their influence and autonomy to steer the regions more toward independence. The new Czech president, Dr. Emil Hacha, resorted to the usual hammer methods. On March 6th, he deployed troops on the Carpato-Ukraine. He deployed troops in the Carpato-Ukraine and appointed General Lev Prichala, their commander, Minister of the Interior and Finance. In Slovakia, Hacha dissolved the regional parliament. He placed the capital, Pressburg, under martial law and jailed 60 Slovakian politicians. Czech soldiers and police transferred to Pressburg. Hacha faced mounting chaos and the threat of open rebellion. He appealed to Dr. Josef Tiso, whom the Slovaks had elected their prime minister, to help restore order. On March 13th, Tiso visited Berlin to ask Hitler how he would react to a Slovakian declaration of independence. The Führer replied only that he had no interest in occupying Slovakia, since the land had never belonged to the German Reich. So, here's an opportunity that would have been strategically advantageous to Germany to go and occupy Slovakia to help guarantee their independence, and he wouldn't do it because he wasn't on an offensive stance, and he didn't want to rule over non-Germans. This Jewish crap we learned in school about Germany wanted to rule over everyone is all a big Jewish lie. It's retconning of history, and it needs to be stopped by the truth, which you're getting right here. Vote Little in 2020, by the way. The Führer replied only that he had no interest in occupying Slovakia, since the land had never belonged to the German Reich. Tiso returned to Pressburg. He proclaimed national independence in parliament the next day. Fearing that the Hungarian army would invade and annex Slovakia, Tiso asked for German protection. Hitler replied, quote, I acknowledge the receipt of your telegram and hereby assume the security of the Slovakian state, end quote. On this day, Czechoslovakia ceased to exist as a republic. The German chancellor pacified the Hungarians by allowing them to occupy Carpato-Ukraine. Hacha requested an audience with Hitler. He and Schlavoski arrived in Berlin by train the night of the 14th. Since taking office, both men had worked to improve relations with Germany. The machinations of Benez's remaining associates, the anti-German press, and a public attitude tainted by nearly 20 years of Czech chauvinism promoted by Benez had sabotaged their efforts. And by the way, what he's failing to mention here is that Jews were probably way overrepresented in that press. Prior to meeting Hitler, Hacha told Ribbentrop that he had come to, quote, place the fate of the Czech state in the hands of the Führer, end quote. During their subsequent conversation, Hitler told Hacha that he was sending the German army across the frontier the following day. He had ordered the OKW to prepare the operation 3 days earlier. The Führer advised his guests to order the Czech army not to resist, quote, in this case, your people still have good prospects for the future. I will guarantee them autonomy far beyond what they could ever have dreamed of in the time of Austria. End quote. By the way, Hungary used to be part of the Habsburg monarchy, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled over by the German dynasty called the Habsburgs. And that's what Hitler's referring to. So, we're just going to move on here. Hacha duly relayed instructions to his army chief, General Jan Savory, to stand down. The German troops who entered Czech territory at 6 a.m. on March 15th had orders forbidding them to fire their weapons. And there's a picture with Hitler greeting some people. It says, Czech Prime Minister Hacha meets with Hitler in Berlin on March 14th, 1939. To the right of the Führer are Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and Weizsäcker. Sorry, there's an umlaut there. Moving on. Advanced elements of the German army occupied the Moravia-Ostrava industrial complex near the Polish frontier. Warsaw was about to exploit the momentary turmoil in Czechoslovakia to militarily seize the center and hold it for Poland. Local Czech residents understood the German initiative and offered no resistance. The Polish government was angry with Hitler for this rebuff of its ambitions. So this is all nonviolent. The Germans mollified the initial hostility of the Czech people, largely thanks to the efforts of the Nationalsozialistische Volkswohlfahrt, the NSV, Germany's National Social Welfare Organization. In the first 10 days of the occupation, it distributed 7 million Reichsmark worth of food to the distressed population. The NSV freely handed out 5 million worth of clothing. The organization concentrated on cities and industrial regions where shortages were more likely to recur than in rural areas. The German military authorities also arranged for the prompt restocking of grocery and department stores. Relief efforts favored the Czech populace and not the remaining ethnic German colony. The army also guarded against spontaneous attempts by members of the local Volksdeutsche Partei, ethnic German party, to gain control of the economy or of public administration. So here, basically, Germany's doing everything it can to make sure that Czechs retain hegemonic power over their economy and culture in their ethnic territory. This is something that no other people would do except for a few, and the Germans were very benevolent. And we're moving on here. The Germans entered a land with 148,000 unemployed. Demobilization of the Czech army substantially increased that number. The Reichsministry of Labor established offices in the Czech Protectorate, as it now became known, to recruit out-of-work persons for German industry. During the first month of the occupation, 15,000 people took advantage of the opportunity to find jobs. Over the next few months, unemployment continued to decline, and in June, the Czech government negotiated trade agreements with Norway, Holland, and several other nations to boost commerce. Hitler ordered the Czech peacetime standing army of 150,000 men reduced to 7,000, including 280 officers. Only citizens of Czech nationality could serve. In consideration of the mortification suffered by officers dismissed by the reduction in force, he arranged for them to receive a full military pension regardless of their length of service. The German military administration lasted just 1 month. The German army commander, Walter von Brauchitsch, dispersed the permanent garrisons to ethnic German communities to reduce offense to the Czechs. At no time during the 1939-1945 war did the Germans induct Czech nationals into their armed forces. Their country remained virtually unscathed throughout the devastating world conflict. So the Germans they did exactly what they promised they would, which was guarantee the autonomy of the Czechs and Czech lands, and they did not try and conscript them. They did not repress them. They didn't try and set up ethnic Germans in hegemonic positions in their culture or in their government. They left them their autonomy. This is something the Jews will never tell you in school. Hacha and his new cabinet resumed control of the government on April 27, 1939, so like 2 months later. Czech remained the official language. Administrative responsibilities included the interior, education, agriculture, justice, transportation, culture, social services, and public works. Germany managed foreign policy and finance. Hitler appointed Konstantin von Neurath to discharge these duties. In his long diplomatic career, Neurath had often demonstrated sympathy and admiration for the Czechs. So this is incredible. The Jews had stoked the Czechs to oppress the Germans, and when the Germans then became the protectors of the Czech Republic, they did not oppress, they did not take vengeance, they were benevolent. They were they were very, very good to them, and that's something you're not going to learn in school. German Army Group Command 3 estimated there were roughly 140,000 German refugees and immigrants in the Sudetenland and Bohemia, Moravia, who had settled there to escape National Socialist rule. The German police arrested 2,500 communists. The assistance of the Czech police facilitated the roundup. On June 7th, Hitler declared general amnesty for all Czech political prisoners in the Sudetenland and in their own country. So he granted amnesty to everyone that had been rounded up as a political prisoner. This is benevolence. This is good rule. This is offering people a chance to reintegrate into society, even if they had been brainwashed by Jews in the past. This is incredible. The Germans maintained a permanent force of 5,000 police officers throughout the Protectorate to combat sabotage and communist subversion. You have to remember, the Comintern had worked very heavily to communize Czechoslovakia. So that the subversion had to be counteracted, which was done benevolently here. The Germans maintained a permanent force of 5,000 police officers throughout the Protectorate to combat sabotage and communist subversion. The Czech population experienced more autonomy, civil liberty, and absence of discrimination under German hegemony than Tomac, Marziak, and Beneš had accorded to the Sudeten Germans, the Slovaks, and the Hungarian minorities during the earlier years of the Republic. No vengeance was taken, in other words. The Germans confiscated most Czech army ordnance and integrated it into their own armed forces. German troops briefly entered Slovakian territory to empty Czech military depots near the frontier. The vast quantity of war materials substantiated Hitler's protest that Czechoslovakia in a coalition with other European powers represented a threat to Germany. During the first week of the occupation, the Germans shipped 24 freight trains filled with military hardware into the Reich. They estimated 500 trains would be necessary to complete the transfer. Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner wrote his wife on March 30th that the quantity of combat ordnance discovered in this small country was, quote, downright frightening, end quote. The inventory included 1,582 aircraft, 2,175 field guns, 468 tanks, 501 anti-aircraft guns, 785 mortars, 43,856 machine guns, over 1 million rifles, 3 million artillery rounds, a considerable array of military specialty items such as bridge building equipment and searchlights, plus over 1 billion rifle rounds for the infantry. It consisted of up-to-date, well-designed weaponry. Modern production facilities such as the Skoda plant were expansive enough to simultaneously fill defense contracts for the USSR. Ribbentrop sent Dr. Friedrich Berber to Prague with a special research staff to peruse documents in the Czech diplomatic archives dating from March 1938 to March 1939. The team examined records, quote, related to the English and French approach to the Czech question, end quote, based on an abundance of documentary evidence assessed both in Prague and a few months earlier in Vienna. Berber's analysis concluded that London had systematically intervened, quote, in the politics of these countries, end quote, in order to, quote, maintain their independence and weaken Germany, end quote. The records also revealed that the British, quote, had acted in the same manner regarding Poland, end quote. The report deduced. Hitler concluded from the findings that, quote, Hitler concluded from the findings that, quote, England wants war, end quote. The next section of Chapter 3 is titled Poland. Just a moment, my computer's frozen. Sorry, just a moment here. There we go. Poland declared independence upon the collapse of Russia and the defeat of the Central Powers in 1918. France supported Polish claims for additional territory in order to strengthen the emerging state. Wilson remarked, quote, the only real interest of France in Poland is in weakening Germany by giving Poland territory to which she has no right, end quote. Wow, that's former President Woodrow Wilson admitting that Germany was having land stolen from it to prop up a state to be used as a weapon against Germany in the future. Wow. President Wilson, he screwed up with the central bank and some other stuff, but it looks like he had some foresight. Wow, I'm impressed. Moving on. The French historian and political analyst Jacques Bonville observed, quote, the liberated peoples of the East have been entrusted with the task of serving as a counterweight to the German multitude, end quote. At the time, the Bolsheviks under Lenin were consolidating their control of Russia. The Red Army invaded Lithuania, which had declared independence in January 1919. The Polish army drove the Bolshevik forces back. Pardon me, I'm still all stuffed up. I've still got a chest cold and pretty bad congestion, so bear with me. Poland's popular military leader, Marshal Józef Pilsudski, became head of state. An aggressive field commander, he invaded the Ukraine in April 1920 to destroy a Soviet troop concentration on the frontier. Believing that Poland must become, quote, a power equal to the great powers of the world, end quote, Pilsudski conquered territories where less than 5% of the population was Polish. The Treaty of Riga ended the Seesaw War against the Red Army on March 18, 1921, with Poland gaining Galicia. By the way, just let me comment, this war with the Jew-Bolshevik-led army by Poland served also the purpose of stopping the Soviet release efforts of the Jews that had seized control of the Bavarian government. Bavaria had become a communist-controlled territory that tried to declare independence from Germany and extend communist rule from Bavaria to the rest of Germany. And there was a relief army under Trotsky that was marching towards Bavaria to help the Jews there expand Jewish Bolshevism beyond Bavaria. Luckily, veterans stood up and stopped the Jew communists, and we removed them from power and hanged them in Bavaria, and the Polish fought off the Jew-led Trotsky or Bronstein Red Army that was trying to get to Bavaria to conquer Germany in the name of Jewish communism. So Poland did some good things too. Anyhow, moving on. On Poland's western frontier in December 1918, the Polish secret military organization Polska Organizacja Wojskowa, the acronym POW, seized Posen, where Polish and German residents lived in harmony. German Freikorps militia launched a successful counterthrust. France's Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch demanded that the Reichsgovernment withdraw these troops from Posen. Too weak to resist the French ultimatum, the German Prime Minister Friedrich Ebert complied. The Polish insurgents continued attacking German villages in the region. President Wilson proposed a plebiscite for Upper Silesia to allow the inhabitants to choose their country. 22,000 POW men staged an insurrection in August 1919 to take the region by force. The Freikorps broke the revolt in less than a week. In February 1920, the Inter-Allied Control Commission assumed the administration of Upper Silesia. Over 11,000 French soldiers, supported by small contingents from the Italian and British armies, arrived to supervise the plebiscite. In the spring of 1921 poll, 706,820 Silesians cast for union with Germany and 479,414 for Poland. Many Polish residents voted to join Germany. The plebiscite was won in Silesia. The plebiscite stated should go to Germany, with an overwhelming majority, 707,000 versus 479,000. While the Allied Commission fumbled with determining the ultimate boundaries, the POW staged another uprising in May 1921. Supplied with French weapons, the insurgents organized an army of 30,000 men. The Polish government officially denied supporting Wojciech Korfanty, the instigator of the revolts. The correspondent for the London Times observed ammunition trains passing regularly from Poland into Upper Silesia. The frontier was, quote, as freely traversed as our London Bridge, end quote, he wrote on May 10th. Though outnumbered, 25,000 Freikorps volunteers counterattacked on May 24th and on May 21st, and forced the Poles onto the defense. Once the Germans began to advance, the French and British stepped in to restore order. In October, the League of Nations awarded nearly a third of the contested territory to Poland. Based on the plebiscite, the entire region should have fallen to Germany. In the portion granted to Poland dwelled 40% of the Upper Silesian population. It contains 6/7 of the zinc and lead production, all the iron, and 91% of the coal. So they gave the resource-rich region to the newly created state, so Germany wouldn't have it, even though Germany won the plebiscite or referendum. So this is just internationalist, globalist meddling to just make sure everything gets tweaked just right in the interest of the Jew globalists. Moving on. At the time, the Bolsheviks under Lenin were... by the way, Lenin was just a Shabbos goy. He spoke Yiddish at home, by the way. Lenin was at least one quarter Jewish, arguably one half Jewish, and he spoke Yiddish and identified as a Jew, according to the Jewish World Encyclopedia. Write that down. That's important to know. So, moving back to this. At the time, the Bolsheviks under Lenin were consolidating their control of Russia. The Red Army invaded Lithuania, which had declared independence in January 1919. And remember, before World War II, according to the Jewish World Encyclopedia, Solzhenitsyn, and many other sources, 85% of the government was Jews. And of those 15% that weren't Jews, most of them were married to Jews or Shabbos Goyim. So, moving on. The Red Army invaded Lithuania, which had declared independence in January 1919. The Polish army drove the Bolshevik forces back. Poland's popular military leader, Marshal Józef Pilsudski, became head of state. An aggressive field commander, he invaded the Ukraine in April 1920 to destroy a Soviet troop concentration on the frontier. And just a comment for me, that's a good thing. They stopped Jew Bolshevism from taking over Ukraine and Poland at the time. But Ukraine eventually gets annexed by the Jews later, before World War II. We'll see that later. Believing that Poland must become a power equal to the great powers of the world, end quote, Pilsudski conquered territories where less than 5% of the population was Polish. The Treaty of Riga ended the Seesaw War against the Red Army on March 18, 1921, with Poland gaining Galicia. On Poland's western frontier in December 1918, the Polish secret military organization POW seized Posen, where Polish and German residents lived in harmony. Hold on, I've already read this page. Let me go back. Oh, wow. My PDF has two of the same pages in a row. Among the lands Germany lost was a 6,300 square mile vertical strip of West Prussia extending from the Baltic coast down to Upper Silesia. Poland required this corridor, the Allies reasoned, to permit her to have unrestricted access to the sea. Within the corridor was the German port of Danzig. Just 15,000 of the city's 400,000 inhabitants were Polish. The people of Danzig overwhelmingly demonstrated for the union with Germany. But the Peace Commission favored Poland. Lloyd George's tenacious resistance forced a compromise. The town became a free city under League of Nations jurisdiction subject to Polish customs administration. During the Weimar Republic, every German administration and most influential political parties had advocated Poland's destruction. This attitude prevailed in the Reichsforeign Office and the Reichswehr as well. In September 1922, General Hans von Seeckt wrote to Chancellor Joseph Welt, quote, Poland's existence is intolerable and incompatible with Germany's vital interests. It must disappear and will do so through its own weakness and through Russia with our aid, end quote. So this isn't National Socialist, this isn't Hitler, this is the Weimar Republic prior to Hitler saying this. The Polish government's oppressive minority policy provoked the ire of other European states. Poland's Jewish, Ukrainian, and German populations suffered legal persecution to disenfranchise them, strip them of political influence, or force their migration out. The regime dismissed German officials and employees from civil service. It confiscated German farms, closed ethnic schools, and forced the pupils to enroll in Polish educational institutions. These measures compelled many Prussian and Silesian Germans to move into Germany. A quarter of the ethnic German population had left Poland by 1926. Heinrich Brüning, German Chancellor from 1930 to 1932, pursued a trade policy with the Heinrich Brüning, the German Chancellor from 1930 to 1932, pursued a trade policy the Poles considered disadvantageous to their commerce. Pilsudski responded by conducting military maneuvers and massing troops near Germany's border. The Polish army concentrated formations in a ring around East Prussia, geographically separated by the corridor from the Reich. In 1930, Mokostowicz, I can't say it, it's a Polish name, the League of Great Powers, a newspaper mirroring Pilsudski's views, published this editorial. Quote, we know that war between Poland and Germany cannot be avoided. We must prepare for this war systematically and energetically. In this war, there will be no prisoners taken. There will be no place for humanitarian feelings, end quote. So this is a Polish newspaper. The Poles became very nationalistic after their independence, so that's to be expected. They hadn't really been independent since King Sobieski sacrificed the Polish kingdom to save Vienna from the Ottoman Turk invasion in 1683. But that is different history from what we're doing right now, so I can talk about that later. Moving on. The Polish General Staff had been weighing options for invading the Reich since 1921. German diplomats considered the appointment to Polish Foreign Minister of Joseph Beck, an army colonel and confidant of Pilsudski's in November 1932, as indicative of a more militant policy. And here's a picture. It says Colonel Beck, second from the left, with fellow officers at a pre-war army exhibition in Krakow. German analysts suspected the appointment of a military man to conduct Polish foreign affairs would lead to more aggressive anti-German policy. And if I remember correctly, that's true. So moving on. Polish saber-rattling provoked resentment in Germany. The Reichsforeign Office refused to renew even minor compacts with Poland about to expire. When Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, relations with his eastern neighbor were strained to the utmost. The Polish press launched a campaign of vilification of the new Chancellor. Pilsudski deployed combat divisions near Danzig and reinforced the 82-man garrison guarding the Westerplatte. This was an army depot situated on an islet bordering metropolitan Danzig. A Pilsudski subordinate wrote in the quasi-official Gazeta Polska, quote, for the Western territories, Poland can and will speak only with the voice of her cannons, end quote. On April 1933, Pilsudski asked Paris for the second time in less than 2 months to join in a, quote, preventative war. So it's not just Czechoslovakia, it was also Poland that was trying to start a war with Germany even in the 1920s, but now again in 1933. So he's asking for, and I quote, a preventative war to invade the Reich in 1933. The French showed no interest. The German representative in Warsaw, Hans von Moltke, discovered the plan and duly warned Hitler. The Führer sidestepped a confrontation. During his first meeting with the Polish envoy on May 2, 1933, he proved gracious and reassuring. Hitler agreed to a public declaration that his government would observe all Polish-German treaties currently in force. In his foreign policy speech to the Reichstag on May 17th, the German Chancellor spoke of, quote, finding a solution to satisfy the understandable demands of Poland just as much as Germany's natural rights, end quote. So, once again, Hitler, the kid's gloves. He's really being much nicer than he has to be. In November, Hitler offered Pilsudski a friendship and non-aggression pact, only after another discreet, unsuccessful bid to enlist France for his, quote, preventative war, end quote, Hobbyhorse did the Marshal agree. The two governments ratified a 10-year treaty the following January. New trade agreements provided a fresh market for Poland's depressed economy. Hitler banned newspaper editorials addressing German claims in the East. That's the power of not having Jews in control of your press. You can do stuff like that. You can stop the people that are pushing for war when your country wants peace. War hawks are not good people. Peace should be the primary objective of any people, of any government. And Hitler was a peaceful man, and he pursued peace, and he made the press pursue peace, which he was only able to do because he removed the Jews from his press. Anyhow, Warsaw relaxed the anti-German tendency of its own press. The Führer directed Danzig's National Socialist Senate to cease complaining to the League of Nations about Polish violations of legal compacts there. The German public disapproved of Hitler's reapproachment toward Poland. So Hitler caught holy hell from the German people for being too nice to Poland and not taking an interventionist approach to the oppressed Germans in Poland. This is incredible. This is the opposite of what the Jews have you taught in school. Hitler was perhaps the most peaceful ruler in history. And even his own people got fed up with how peaceful he was at times. Jesus. Up is down, left is right, right? Anyhow, U.S. Ambassador William Dodd reported that even convinced National Socialists were disillusioned that the Führer had concluded a pact with Warsaw. So even his own party was mad at Hitler for being too peaceful with the Poles. Prussian nobles in the General Staff and Foreign Office harbored anti-Polish sentiments and likewise rejected the change of policy. In October 1935, Moltke cabled from Warsaw, quote, today the German minority in Poland feels left in the lurch by the German Reich, end quote. Hitler stayed on course. Warsaw's new emissary in Berlin, Josef Lipski, experienced a warmth and popularity among his hosts previously unimagined for a Polish diplomat. After Pilsudski's death in May 1935, two government officials assumed virtual autonomy in their respective ministries, much to the detriment of Polish-German relations. These were Foreign Minister Beck and the Army Commander-in-Chief Marshal Edward Reitz-Smigli. Both were disciples of an expansionist foreign policy. My God, I wonder who could be encouraging that. Moving on. The Friendship Treaty with Germany evoked little sense of obligation on Poland's part. From Warsaw, Moltke informed his superiors, quote, the Poles think that they no longer need to restrict their steps against the Poles think that they no longer need to restrict their steps against the German minority. They must be gaining the impression from the lack of any reaction in the German press that all infringements will be accepted by the German public opinion without objection, end quote. In February 1936, the German Consul General in Thorn, Kischler, wrote Berlin about the disproportionate transfer of German farms into Polish hands through government-implemented land reforms. Quote, as much German property as possible is supposed to be broken up before the expiration of the 10-year agreement, end quote. So the oppression against the Germans is really stepping up in Poland. Consul Nöldecke in Katowice described how on March 15th, quote, in Königsstädte, that's a weird name. In Königsstädte, an assembly of the German Farmers' Union was dispersed by a mob armed with sticks and clubs, during which German performers of the Upper Silesian Country Theater who were uninvolved bystanders were physically abused, end quote. So it looks like the Poles went into a farmers union and beat up people that were doing a cultural festival. So things are getting pretty bad. It's starting to get worse than things had been for the Czech Germans, for the Sudeten Germans, and Hitler. If I remember correctly, Hitler remains very even keeled and continues to give concession after concession to the Poles, trying not to give the Jews the war they wanted. So moving on. Diplomatic relations between Poland and the Reich further deteriorated due to a simultaneous tariff dispute. Dissatisfied with Germany's compensation for coal trains crossing the corridor from the Reich to supply East Prussia's energy needs, Warsaw announced in January 1936 that it would curtail 50 to 80% of German rail traffic there. The Polish Ministry of Transportation threatened to block it completely during negotiations. In March, Beck informed the French that Poland was ready to join France in a war against Germany. So once again, they're trying to, 1936, just like in 1933, the Poles send an emissary to France saying it's time to attack Germany now. Moving on. Marshal Ritz Smigli visited Paris in September. He persuaded the French to loan Poland $500 million in cash and war material to upgrade the Polish army. Warsaw already devoted over a third of the budget to armaments, even though the country suffered one of the highest illiteracy rates in Europe and much of the population lived in poverty. Ritz Smigli ordered General Tadeusz Kotzebue to draft a war plan against Germany. Completed in January 1938, the study envisioned a war with the Reich for 1939. To date, Hitler had never made a threatening gesture to Poland. Of all the territories robbed from the Reich after World War I, the German people felt most keenly the loss of Danzig and their lands taken by Poland. To placate his own people and remove one or more obstacle to improving relations with Warsaw, Hitler required at least a nominal correction of the Versailles Arrangement. He limited his proposal to two revisions. First, he asked to construct an autobahn and railroad line across the corridor to connect Germany with East Prussia. The German diplomat Julius Schnurre had already suggested this to Beck in 1935 without receiving an answer. Secondly, Hitler wanted Danzig to come under German sovereignty. In return, he was prepared to acknowledge Germany's eastern border fixed by the Allied Peace Commission as final, something no Weimar administration had hitherto done, and offer Poland a 25-year non-aggression pact. So basically, Hitler was willing to give Poland a bunch of lands permanently that were full of almost entirely Germans. He just wanted to be able to have a railroad to East Prussia, or an autobahn. Very, very, very generous terms. Terms that no previous German government after World War I would have been willing to give because there were too many concessions that hurt Germany. Hitler wanted peace at pretty much all costs, and the Jews wouldn't let him have that, as we'll see later. The Autobahn plan meant that Hitler was willing to renounce an entire province in exchange for a strip of real estate wide enough to accommodate a highway. Financed by the Reich, the project would utilize Polish labor and construction materials to help relieve unemployment in Poland. The recovery of Danzig required even less of Warsaw. The Danzig territory, encompassing 730 square miles, that's tiny, was under League of Nations, not Polish, jurisdiction. Regarding the city's value as a harbor, the Poles no longer needed it for nautical export. Further up the coast, they had constructed the port city of Gdynia, which opened in 1926, offering economic incentives to shippers. They had taken more than half of Danzig's commerce by 1930. Hitler's package called for the Reich's forfeiture of Upper Silesia with its valuable industry, Posen, and West Prussia. So Hitler was willing to give up 3 provinces to the Poles that were ethnically German. This is incredible. This is more than the German people can stomach, but Hitler still managed to stay in power while offering massive portions of German-speaking territory to Poland as concessions. This is incredible. To call Hitler a warmonger is the opposite of the truth. This man was almost ousted from power by his own people because he was giving too many concessions. Hitler was giving more than the German people were willing to give. He was willing to give anything for peace because he knew the Jews wanted war. Moving on. These provinces had been German for centuries and had belonged to Germany less than 20 years before. Nevertheless, it would abandon nearly 1 million ethnic Germans residing there to foreign rule, despite the fact that since March 1933, the Reich's Foreign Office had documented 15,000 cases of abuse against Poland's ethnic German colony. The Führer was willing to publicly announce that no more territorial issues exist with Poland. No Weimar administration could have survived such an offer. So, oh, I see what's happening. There's a button I'm pressing that's taking me back. Just a moment here. Just a moment, I lost my place. And my computer is frozen. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Here, let me go back and put a marker on this to edit later to take out that part. So here we go. Meeting in Berchtesgaden with Polish Ambassador Lipski on October 24th, 1938, Ribbentrop brought the German revisions to the table. His guest disputed the Reich's perception of Danzig's status as, quote, a product of Versailles, end quote. Only Poland's rise, Lipski contended, had lifted the city from its insignificance. He told Ribbentrop that public opinion would never accept the city's transfer to Germany. Warsaw reaffirmed Lipski's position in writing on October 31st. The letter conceded that Poland was prepared to guarantee the right of Danzig's German minority to preserve its national and cultural identity. Describing the population of the city that was 96% German as a minority was a studied provocation which Hitler decided to overlook. The Polish press campaign against Germany resumed. So it looks like the previous guy, I forget how to pronounce his name, Hitler had gotten him to warm up to Germany. The previous head of the Polish state was just, very happy that Hitler was going to give 3 provinces of Germany to Poland to keep the peace and to make good relations with Poland. But the new guys that came to power when the last guy died in Poland wanted war, and there was nothing that Hitler could give them that would stop this call for war that they had the press echo, which was largely Jewish. Anyhow, moving on. On January 5th, 1939, Beck visited Germany to negotiate with Hitler. The Führer insisted that Danzig's return to Germany must be part of any final settlement with Poland. He reassured Beck that the Reich would never simply declare that the city had returned to Germany and present Warsaw with fait accompli. He pledged that no final arrangement would deprive Poland of her access to the sea. Beck asked for time to weigh the situation carefully, and Beck's the representative from Poland here. In mid-January, Beck told Ritz-Smigli of his decision to reject the German proposals, though 2 weeks later he mendaciously reassured Ribbentrop that he was still contemplating the matter. So privately, this guy was saying that he was never going to consider the German proposals, and even 2 weeks after he said this, he was still telling the Germans, yeah, I'll consider it. A wave of fresh persecution swept over the ethnic German minority. On February 25th, the British ambassador there, Sir Howard Kennard, reported to Halifax on a dialogue with Moltke concerning farmhands and industrial workers in Poland who were, quote, being dismissed because they happened to be Germans, end quote. In addition to the forced closing of German schools, it was becoming practically impossible for a German living in Poland to earn enough to exist. Kennard concluded that there was, quote, little likelihood of the Polish authorities doing anything to improve matters, end quote. An unrelated episode aggravated tensions. On March 22nd, The Germans recovered Memel from Lithuania. On March 22nd, the Germans recovered Memel from Lithuania. And that's part of the song Deutschland über alles. Memel is considered one of the borders of the German Reich in the song. This was a narrow 700 square mile strip of northeastern Prussia, which the Lithuanians seized by force in 1923. The League of Nations demanded that the territory be governed according to democratic principles. In the 1925 elections, 94% of the voters, including many Lithuanian residents, cast for German parties. The Lithuanian government in Kaunas refused to recognize the results. The entire country fell under a dictatorship the following year. The authorities began jailing Prussian residents found guilty of, quote, preserving German heritage, end quote. Doesn't that sound a lot like today? By the way, Lithuania became part of the Soviet Union, so it was Jew-controlled. And it's actually Jews from Lithuania that set forth from the Soviet Union-controlled Lithuania in the 1920s that founded the ANC, the African National Congress. And these Jews from Lithuania later wrote the song Kill the Boer. Just a little information for you there. The one thing about this book by Tador is he doesn't identify who the Jews are. And that's a huge problem. To fully understand this book, you have to understand the Jewish perspective here, which he's leaving out, I think, intentionally. Anyhow, that's a problem. But still, the overall picture is Hitler is almost getting removed from power by his own people because he's being too damn peaceful. Anyhow, after the Austrian Anschluss, Memel Germans organized public demonstrations. In November 1938, Kaunas offered to negotiate with Berlin over the region's future. In an internationally supervised plebiscite in December, 87% of voters decided for union with Germany. Ribbentrop promised Lithuanian Foreign Minister Juozas Urbšys economic incentives for his country. Upon the transfer of Memel back to Germany, the Lithuanians employed their own dock workers and administrative personnel at the harbor there. They also operated a railroad across the now German strip of Memel territory directly connecting the port to Lithuania. This was the same solution that Hitler had proposed to Warsaw regarding Danzig and the corridor. During the weeks before the final settlement with Kaunas, Berlin deployed the 3 army divisions garrisoned in East Prussia on the border with Memel. Fritz Smigli declared this to be evidence that Germany was about to annex Danzig. On March 23, 1939, he accordingly mobilized a large part of Poland's army reserve. Since Memel was at the opposite end of the province from Danzig, the 3 divisions were actually moving away from the city that Fritz Smigli claimed they were about to seize. The Memel affair coincided with Germany's occupation of the Czech Rump state on March 15th. Beck exploited the occasion to negotiate with London to form an alliance against Germany. On March 24th, Beck told Lipski and senior members of his staff that Hitler was losing the faculty to think and act rationally. Poland's, quote, determined resistance, end quote, might bring him to his senses. Otherwise, Beck proclaimed, quote, we will fight, end quote. Hitler maintained a conciliatory posture. His army commander-in-chief, General Brauchitsch, that's a hard name, Brauchitsch, noted, quote, Führer does not want to settle the Danzig question by force, end quote. Hitler canceled a March 24th directive that the diplomat Ernst von Weizsäcker had prepared for Moltke as guidance for resuming negotiations. The Führer considered it, quote, somewhat harshly formulated, end quote, and objected to its tenor, quote, confronting the Poles with a sort of friend or foe option, end quote. Returning to Berlin, Lipski delivered a letter to Ribbentrop on March 26, formally rejecting the Danzig Autobahn proposal. Lipski bluntly told his host, quote, "Any further pursuit of these German plans, especially as far as the return of Danzig to the Reich is concerned, will mean war with Poland." End quote. This threat, together with Ritz Smigley's partial mobilization against Germany, violated the 1934 non-aggression and friendship treaty. The pact stated word for word, quote, "Under no circumstance will the signatories resort to the use of force for the purpose of settling issues in controversy," end quote. So the Germans are keeping up their end of the bargain, the Poles are not. The British responded favorably to an alliance with Poland. The Western democracies had just lost Czechoslovakia as an ally flanking the Reich. Her military-industrial resources were now at German disposal. The British Army Chief of Staff who warned Chamberlain that in the event of war against Germany, it would be better to have Poland on the Allies' side. On March 30th, Kennard received instructions from London to present the British offer to guarantee Poland. Beck accepted immediately. The next day, Chamberlain explained the details in the House of Commons. Quote, "In the event of any action which clearly threatens Polish independence and which the Polish government accordingly considers it vital to resist with the national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend Polish government all support in their power." End quote. And here's a picture. Foreign journalists interview ethnic Germans who had fled their homesteads in western Poland and sought refuge in the Reich in the summer of 1939. Some young Germans in traditional clothing, the woman with traditional German garb on. Look like nice people. I wonder if they survived the war. Moving on. Beck visited London to conclude details for the alliance on April 3rd. On the 23rd, Warsaw mobilized another 334,000 army reservists, and again in the absence of threats from Germany. I'm going to take a little break here. We're going to play Königsgleiche Marsch. We're talking about Preußen, or what's that in English? Prussia. So we'll play the Königsgleiche Marsch. Pause my offline recording here. Enjoy the song, Goyim.
At Intuit, you're not just solving coding and you're solving something bigger.
Okay, I'm back. Pause the music and restart the offline recording here. Back to Hitler's revolution here. Hitler addressed the Reichstag on April 28th. He explained how the Anglo-Polish agreement obligated the Poles to take a military position against the Reich should it enter into an armed conflict with any state guaranteed by England. Hitler continued, quote, "This obligation contradicts the agreement I previously made with Marshal Pilsudski. Since the 1934 agreement only takes into account obligations already in existence at that time, namely Poland's commitments regarding France. To belatedly expand these commitments is contrary to the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact. Under these circumstances, I would never have concluded this pact then, for what sense does it make to have a non-aggression pact if it leaves a number of exceptions for one partner practically wide open?" End quote. Hitler voided the compact. He added in his speech that he would welcome a Polish initiative to negotiate a new treaty governing Polish-German relations. End quote. So basically, Poland violated its non-aggression pact with Germany by creating additional alliances against Germany. Moving on. Warsaw's agreement with London opened a floodgate of war scares and hostile editorials in the Polish press. The German consul general in Posen reported to Berlin on March 31st, quote, "Scarcely a day goes by in which Posen newspapers don't publish more or less aggressive articles or insulting observations about Germans," end quote. Although Hitler had personally instructed his Foreign Office that there must be, quote, "no talk of war," end quote, in the negotiations, the French ambassador in Warsaw, Leon Noel, reported to Paris, quote, "Patriotic sentiment among the Poles has reached a zenith in all parties and classes, thanks to the German threats," end quote. Poland's ethnic German community suffered a backlash of media-generated Polish chauvinism. On April 13th, the German consul in Danzig cabled to Berlin that rural Germans in the corridor are so cowed that they have already buried their most valuable possessions. They no longer risk traveling roads and fields by daylight. They spend their nights in hiding places beyond the farms for fear of being attacked," end quote. On May 11th, editions of the Polish newspaper Dziennik Białowieski, Bromberg Daily News, published an editorial asserting that the Germans in Poland, quote, "know that in case of war, no indigenous enemy will escape alive. The Führer is far away, but the Polish soldier close by, and in the woods there's no shortage of limbs," end quote. The previous month, the Polish mayor of Bromberg, a town with a comparatively large German population, told journalists that if Hitler invaded there, he'd be stepping over the corpses of Bromberg's Germans. So basically, this is a threat that if there was a conflict with Germany, the Poles would exterminate the Germans in Poland, in provinces that were German prior to the Versailles Treaty. This is crazy. This is huge provocation. They were trying to get the Germans into a war. Beck explained his policy to the Polish parliament on May 5th. He claimed that Danzig was not German, but belonged to Poland for centuries. He attributed the city's prosperity to commerce conducted by Poland ferrying export wares into Danzig via the Vistula River, omitting the fact that the waterway was no longer navigable, thanks to 19 years of improper maintenance under Polish administration. Beck disparaged Hitler's offer to recognize Polish sovereignty over the corridor, Posen, and Upper Silesia in exchange for Danzig. Since the provinces were already incorporated into Poland, he argued Hitler was giving nothing in return. Quote, "A nation with self-respect makes no one-sided concessions," end quote, he crowed. Historians praise Beck for defiantly defending his country from becoming a German satellite. Since Hitler's proposals included an offer for Poland to join the Anti-Comintern Pact, which is an anti-communist pact, reaching a Danzig settlement with the Reich would have supposedly drawn the Poles into an alliance with Germany against the USSR. Well, oh God, you can't have that. You can't have the Polish Catholics joining up with the Catholic and Protestant Germans against Jew-controlled Bolshevism. You can't have that. You need to have Bolshevism everywhere. Anyhow, Warsaw would then have eventually become embroiled in Hitler's planned military crusade against Russia. Beyond the fact that no German documents exist to support this theory, it overlooks the essence of the Anti-Comintern Pact. Its purpose was to promote cooperation among civilized nations to prevent internal communist subversion. Governments would share intelligence, much in the same way that Interpol affairs do to combat global terrorism today. Also, Hitler had expressed his often quoted ideas about invading Russia when he wrote Mein Kampf during the previous decade. After the Bolsheviks consolidated power in the former Tsarist Empire, the Führer no longer advocated such an option. Through personal observation and discussions with diplomats in Berlin, Henderson was able to convey to London a realistic picture of German opinion. He wrote Halifax in May, quote, "It must be borne in mind that Danzig and the corridor was the big question prior to 1933. One of the most unpopular actions which Hitler ever did was his 1934 treaty with Pilsudski. He had the whole of his party against him. Today, the most moderate Germans who are opposed to a world war are behind him in his present offer to Poland," end quote. Henderson added that foreign emissaries in Berlin also considered Hitler's proposals justifiable. Quote, "According to my Belgian colleague, practically all the diplomatic representatives here regard the German offer in itself as surprisingly favorable," end quote. As a surprisingly favorable one, end quote. Just a moment, I have to do something real quick. I'll be back in 15 seconds. Okay. I'm back. Henderson grasped that Hitler's package was not a demand for Polish territory, but accepted a significant loss of formerly German land to Poland. Right, let me make sure this is recording. Yeah. In a May 17th dispatch to Halifax, Henderson wrote, quote, "The fact that what was regarded here as a generous offer of a 25-year German guarantee of the existing Polish frontier in exchange for a satisfactory settlement of the Danzig and corridor problem had been rejected offhand by Poland has not only incensed Herr Hitler personally, but has made a deep impression on the country as a whole," end quote. The ambassador also referred to, quote, "the traditional German feeling of hatred for Poland, particularly in the army, and Polish ingratitude for Germany's past services," end quote. On May 16th, Henderson summarized a conversation with Weizsäcker in a letter to Sir Miles Cadogan, the Undersecretary in the Foreign Office. Quote, He, like all Germans, feels bitterly about the Poles. They grabbed what they could after Vienna and Munich and then bit the hand that fed them on these occasions. That is the German view, nor is there a single German who does not regard Hitler's offer to Poland as excessively generous and broad-minded," end quote. So Hitler was being so gracious and offering so many concessions to Poland that he was risking popular support in Germany. Moving on. Hitler understood that he could never normalize relations with Poland without a Danzig settlement. The British guarantee for Poland had robbed Hitler of the opportunity to withdraw his demands without losing face. On April 3, 1939, he ordered the OKW to draft a study for combat operations against Poland. He stipulated that the military solution would only be exercised, quote, "if Warsaw revises its policy toward Germany and assumes a posture threatening to the Reich," end quote. Berlin continued to receive reports from its consulates in Poland regarding harsh treatment of the German colony there. On May 8th, on instructions from Hitler, press chief Otto Dietrich directed newspaper editors to, quote, practice a certain restraint in reporting such incidents, quote, end quote, and not to publish them on the front page. So, this is amazing. Hitler was asking the Germans in the newspaper industry not to publish atrocities that the Poles were committing against the ethnic Germans in Prussia, or what I guess technically Poland at this point, West Prussia. This is incredible. He was asking his newspapers not to report atrocities that were being committed against Germans because he didn't want the German people calling for war, because he was doing his best to keep Germany out of a war, because the Jews, the moment that the Rothschilds had been sent packing from Germany, had declared war on Germany. In 1932 and 1933, there was a newspaper article, Judea declares war on Germany. This is incredible. You have to remember, the Jews had already declared war on Germany, and they were pulling all the strings they could to get different countries to go to war with Germany. And you're going to see evidence of Jewish foreign ministers and Jewish people in the State Department of the United States egging on war with Germany. And that's coming later in the book. You'll see this. On May 8th, on instructions from Hitler, press chief Otto Dietrich directed newspaper editors, quote, to practice certain restraint in reporting such incidents, end quote, and not publish them on the front page. Regarding the Polish media, Henderson observed, quote, the fantastic claims of irresponsible Polish elements for domination over East Prussia and other German territory afford cheap fuel to the flames, end quote. So the Polish papers were trying to egg on a war and get people to want to invade the still German-controlled areas of ethnic Germany. In June, Hubert Gladwin-Jeb and Sir William Strang of the British Foreign Office visited Warsaw. Jeb sent back a report on the 9th that summarized the discussions with Polish government ministers and army officers. He quoted a Polish economist in Warsaw's foreign ministry as describing how Polish farmers anticipated generous grants of German land after the war with Germany. Jeb opined that the Polish general staff was, quote, overly optimistic, end quote, and that officials in Warsaw had become, quote, amazingly arrogant, end quote, since the British guarantee. The following month, British General Sir Edmund Ironside visited Poland. Reitz Smigley told him that war with Germany is unavoidable. None of the British emissaries said anything to the Poles to mollify this bellicose attitude. So it looks like the British are horrified that the Poles are using the pledge of alliance to try and crank up or to ratchet up the war cries against the Germans. So the British are thinking, oh God, what have we gotten ourselves into? Or at least the British military. The Foreign Office was full of Jews, the Foreign Ministry in England. Moving on. Since June, as reported by Moltke, 70% of the Germans in Upper Silesia were out of work. 70%! Holy crap! Compared to Poland's national unemployment rate of only 16%. The Reichsgovernment registered 70,000 ethnic German refugees who had recently fled Polish sovereign territory. Another 15,000 had taken refuge in Danzig. Among the acts of brutality inflicted on those still in Poland were 5 documented cases of castration. Oh my God, there were Poles castrating Germans. That's crazy. Kennard protested to the Polish government about the abuse of the German minority. The complaint, quote, did not appear to have any definite results, end quote, he notified his superiors. The crisis also forced Danzig, still administered by League of Nations Commissioner Karl Burkhardt, under Poland's customs union. The city senate was embroiled in a perpetual controversy over the conduct of the Polish tariff inspectors. Originally numbering 6 in 1939, the roster had climbed to well over 100. Polish officials performing these duties roamed areas beyond their jurisdiction, primarily interested in potential military details. They rendezvoused at Danzig's rail terminal, which was under Polish administration. A transmitter there relayed intelligence to Warsaw. In the event of war, the inspectors were to lead irregular troops supplied from arms caches concealed in the city to hold positions in Danzig until the Polish army arrived. Danzig Senate President Artur Grisa protested to the Polish commissioner in Danzig, Marjan Chodaki, on June 3, 1939, about the customs inspectors. Chodaki replied that the number of his customs agents was still insufficient because German inspectors were not doing their job. He threatened economic sanctions against Danzig. In another note, August 4th, Chodacki stated that Polish customs officials would henceforth be armed. Interference with their activity would result in immediate reprisal against Danzig. The Poles threatened to block the import of foodstuffs. Beck informed Kennard that Poland would intervene militarily if the Danzig Senate failed to comply with Polish terms. On August 9th, Weizsäcker met with the Polish charge d'affaires in Berlin, Michael Lubomirski. He protested the Polish ultimatum to Danzig of August 4th. Sanctions against the, quote, free city, unquote, Weizsäcker warned, may result in Danzig seeking stronger economic ties with Germany herself. The next day, an undersecretary in Warsaw's foreign ministry told the German charge d'affaires that any involvement by the Reichsgovernment in the Danzig issue would be regarded by Poland as an act of war. Ritz Smigli contributed to tensions with remarks made in a public speech, quote, soon we'll be marching against the hereditary German enemy to finally knock out his poison fangs. The first step on this march will be Danzig. Keep ready for the day of reckoning with this arrogant German race, end quote. Burkhardt described Poland's intentions as, quote, excessively belligerent, end quote. Warsaw issued an official press release detailing how Grisa had withdrawn his demands after the note exchange with Chodacki. According to the Polish press, a single, mildly harsh note had, quote, forced Hitler to his knees, end quote. The Anglo-French media triumphantly reported that the Führer had to, quote, climb down, end quote. Hitler told Burkhardt on August 11th, quote, the press said I lost my nerve, that threats are the only way to deal with me. That was backed down when the Poles stood firm. That we backed down when the Poles stood firm. That I had only been bluffing last year. That my bluff flopped thanks to Poland's courage that the Czechs didn't have. I read idiotic remarks in the French press that I lost my nerve. I've read idiotic remarks in the French press that I've lost my nerve while the Poles kept theirs, end quote. Hitler asked Burkhardt, quote, could you go yourself to London? If we want to avoid catastrophes, the matter is rather urgent, end quote. Halifax, certainly no friend of Germany, cabled Kennard on August 15th, quote, I have the impression that Hitler is still undecided and anxious to avoid war, end quote. The day before, Roger Machins in the British Foreign Office wrote England's delegate in Geneva, Frank Walter, that the Führer wanted to open negotiations to prevent an armed clash. Historians assert that Hitler was determined to invade Poland. However, had this been his intention, he could have instructed the Danzig Senate to pass a resolution abolishing League of Nations jurisdiction and returning the city to the Reich's sovereignty. This would have provoked the Polish military response Beck warned of, and Germany could then intervene with her own army in order to defend Danzig's population's right to self-determination. Given the sensitive issue of democratic principles and the fact that Poland was striking the first blow, it would have been difficult for Britain to justify support for Poland under the provisions of the guarantee. The Polish government rounded up, quote, disloyal, unquote, ethnic Germans and transported them to concentration camps. Authorities closed daily traffic between Upper Silesia and Germany, preventing thousands of ethnic Germans from commuting to their jobs in the Reich. Polish coastal anti-aircraft batteries fired on Lufthansa passenger planes flying over the Baltic Sea to East Prussia. The Luftwaffe provided fighter escorts for the airliners. In Danzig, the police chief formed his law enforcement personnel into 2 rifle regiments. In defiance of the League of Nations Charter, the city remilitarized. The Germans transferred a battalion from SS Death Head Regiment 4 to Danzig. The 1,500-man SS Home Guard Danzig paraded publicly on Danzig's Mayfield on August 18th. The Poles evacuated the families of their civil servants, fortified public buildings and installations with armor plate and barbed wire, and posted machine gun nests at bridges. There's a picture of German soldiers marching. It says, 2 weeks before the outbreak of war, the SS Home Guard Danzig parades in the Free City before Gauleiter Albert Forster. In his directive to the armed forces the previous April, Hitler had cited isolating Poland as a prerequisite for military option. On August 23rd, Germany concluded a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The pact, signed in Moscow, contains a secret clause defining mutual spheres of interest. It stated, quote, "The question of whether or not maintaining an independent Polish state will appear desirable for both parties' interests and how this state should be divided can be clarified in the course of further political developments," end quote. In return for roughly half of Poland, the Soviet dictator gave Germany a free hand to invade. The Germans hoped that the news of Soviet-German reapproachment would demonstrate to Beck that his country's position had become precarious, compelling him to return to the conference table. Beck, however, dismissed the alliance as untenable because Russia and Germany harbored serious ideological rivalry. A Warsaw communique stated, quote, "The conclusion of the non-aggression pact has no influence on Poland's situation or policy," end quote. On August 23rd, Hitler told his armed forces adjutant that the military must be ready to invade Poland by the morning of the 26th. The Führer then postponed the attack, explaining to General Keitel that he needed to, quote, "gain time for further negotiations," end quote, still seeking a, quote, "solution without bloodshed," end quote. The Poles, without provocation from Germany, closed Danzig's border. Since the metropolis imported much of its foodstuffs, this created a critical situation for the population. Hitler and Göring requested British mediation to help persuade Warsaw to resume talks. From Warsaw, Kennard cabled London on August 25th that, were Beck and Lipski to seek an audience with Hitler, the Führer would consider this a, quote, "sign of weakness," end quote, and respond with an ultimatum. Chamberlain concluded the alliance with Poland the same day. Along the German-Polish frontier, Polish border guards fired on ethnic German refugees attempting to flee into Germany. So the Poles were firing on Germans that were trying to escape the persecution. Crazy, huh? German infantry patrols crossed into Poland and fought to free them. On the 26th, a Polish cavalry unit rode boldly through German villages near Neidenburg in East Prussia. The German Army's Artillery Regiment 57 engaged the horsemen on Sovereign Reich territory. The Poles withdrew, leaving 47 dead on the battlefield. Hitler told Ribbentrop, quote, "I would like to think that Beck and Lipski have good intentions, but they are no longer in control of the situation. They are captives of a public attitude that has become white-hot through excesses of their own propaganda and the bragging of the military. Even if they wanted to negotiate, they aren't in a position to do so. This is the real root of the tragedy," end quote. Ribbentrop handed Hitler a telegram describing 3 further incidents of Polish gunners firing on German commercial aircraft. The Führer responded, quote, "This is pure anarchy. What are we supposed to do?" end quote. On August 29th, Hitler received a half-hearted pledge from London to urge the Poles to enter negotiations without, however, stating when. Tired of these dilatory tactics, Hitler wrote back that he expected a Polish diplomat empowered to negotiate by the following day. Examining the note in front of Hitler that evening, Henderson protested that it, quote, "has the ring of an ultimatum," end quote. The Führer retorted, quote, "The sentence only emphasizes the urgency of the moment. Consider that at any time it could come to a serious incident when 2 mobilized armies are confronting one another," end quote. Henderson insisted that the deadline was too short. Hitler responded, quote, "We've been repeating the same thing for a week. This senseless game can't go on forever. My people are bleeding day after day," end quote. In Warsaw, Beck, Ryszmigli, and the defense minister Tadeusz Kaspersky conferred. They decided to declare general mobilization the next morning. The German... crap. I lost my place. Just a moment. I pressed a button on the keyboard. Okay, here we go. German diplomats and lawyers spent the morning of August 30th preparing the 16-point Marienwerder proposal as a basis for discussions with the Poles. The salient points were Danzig's immediate return to the Reich, a German transit route linking East Prussia to Germany, Gdynia remaining under Polish sovereignty, a minority protection treaty, and a plebiscite for the population of the Northern Corridor region. Göring emphasized that the Führer is trying to avoid infringement of Poland's vital interests. Henderson confessed to London that Hitler is considering how generous he can be. Chamberlain's cabinet concluded that the proposal does not harm Poland's interest nor threaten her independence. Even the suggested corridor plebiscite should not have concerned Warsaw, since it claimed that the population there was 90% Polish. The French government recommended that to the Poles that they negotiate. London telegrammed Kennard, instructing him to formally protest Poland's recent practice of shooting at German refugees. The Polish Foreign Office assumed that Hitler would interpret any willingness on its part to negotiate as a sign of weakness. In reality, simply receiving the German 16-point plan represented no threat to Poland. It would have opened a dialogue, and at the very least postponed the outbreak of war. The Poles could have broken off discussions if Berlin imposed an ultimatum. They could have fully relied on the support of the Western powers. Beck, however, wanted no negotiations. On August 31st, he cabled Lipski with the instructions to inform Ribbentrop that Warsaw will, quote, weigh the recommendation of the British government to negotiate in favorable light and give a formal answer to this question in a few hours, end quote. In the same message, Beck instructed his ambassador not to discuss anything with the Germans and that he is not authorized to receive their proposals. That morning, Sir George Ogilvie-Forbes tried to give a copy of Hitler's 16-point program to Lipski at the Polish embassy in Berlin. The Pole refused, replying that, quote, in the event of war, civil strife will break out in this country and Polish troops will march successfully to Berlin, end quote. And there's a picture of Hitler addressing the Reichstag on September 1st. Hitler blames Poland's, quote, mobilization, increased terrorism, and mounting pressure on ethnic Germans, end quote, for the outbreak of hostilities. And just a comment from me, I remember in the schools that when I was learning in middle school and high school, they said that the Germans were printing fake articles about fake atrocities happening to Germans in Poland. And this is the opposite. The opposite is true. Real atrocities, castrations, and murders were happening to Germans in Poland, and Hitler was ordering the newspapers not to print the atrocities. So this is the opposite of what we learned in school. The Jews control our educational system, and that needs to stop, or else we will be doomed to repeat history because we won't understand it. We'll only believe these big Jewish lies instead of understanding true history, which is why we're doing this audiobook. It's critical that you understand true history. The radio monitoring station in the Reichsair Ministry intercepted Beck's transmission ordering Lipski not to accept a copy of Germany's Marienwerder proposals. Hitler knew that Poland would not compromise over Danzig and the corridor. He nonetheless postponed the military operation once more under Göring's request for a last-minute conference with Henderson and the Swedish mediator Birger Dahlhaus. Later that day, Göring's conference took place. He showed Henderson a transcript of Beck's instructions sent to Lipski. Henderson wrote Halifax, quote, The highly efficient German intelligence system proved its worth that afternoon in Berlin. Beck's telephone call, including the secret message, was instantly decoded. Here was proof to the German government of Poland's delaying tactics and refusal to negotiate seriously. End quote. The meeting between Henderson and Göring was cordial, but failed to reach a solution. A session between Lipski and Ribbentrop the same evening was also fruitless. Hitler summoned Keitel at 9 p.m. The directive he gave the general began, quote, "Now that all political possibilities for relieving the intolerable conditions for Germany and her eastern border by peaceful means are exhausted, I have decided for a solution by force," end quote. Less than 8 hours later, the German armed forces invaded Poland. Historical documents reveal the attack on Poland was not a step in a long-planned, systematic program to expand Germany's living space. Hitler ordered the offensive upon the failure to achieve a negotiated settlement. Among the most important issues was the welfare of the ethnic German colony beyond the Reich's borders. Though to wage war for the sake of people related by blood, but no longer by nationality, may today seem unjustified, the present-day global community concept rejects the notion that a nation can be defined more by its race than by geographical boundaries. Boom! Tater just hit it out of the park with that one. During the 1930s, however, pride of ethnic heritage was a powerful force in the consciousness of the European peoples. You have to remember, this is before Boasian anthropology took over and destroyed the concept of in-group preference in ethnic Europeans. This is before the lie that there's no such thing as race was spread, which no one believes except for white people. And white people are doomed to get screwed over unless they realize that race is real, and every race other than whites realizes this, especially the Jews, who instilled that lie in us that there's no such thing as race. If you don't think there's such thing as race, look at what's happening to the white people in South Africa. They're being butchered. And that's not the fault of the South African blacks or the Zulus that came in as economic migrants in the 19th century, that they're not indigenous there. That is a result of the Jews having brought them in. And we can go into that another time. We'll do a book on South Africa at some point. Moving on. The 1938 Munich Accord, by which Germany regained the Sudetenland territory populated by ethnic Germans under foreign rule, was regarded by the Reichsforeign Office as a legal precedent. Quote, "The right of the protection from the mother state was fundamentally acknowledged once and for all, and through an international act in which the four great powers and three other states took part," end quote. In August 1939, Hitler confronted a serious situation regarding Danzig and the German minority in Poland. Blockaded by the Poles since August 24th, the Free City's German population faced economic ruin and potential starvation. During the month's final days, Polish radicals murdered over 200 ethnic German residents of Western Poland. Quote, "German intervention was completely legitimate in accordance with, on one hand, the right of the mother state to protect its ethnic families living under foreign rule, and on the other hand, with respect to the right to self-determination," end quote. As a German diplomat asserted, Hitler wrote Daladier on August 27th, quote, "I would despair of an honorable future for my people if under such circumstances we were not resolved to settle the matter no matter what." End quote. There's a picture here, German troops surrounded by women and children. In the city that Chamberlain announced needed protection from Germany, citizens of Danzig welcomed the first German troops to enter after war broke out with Poland, and the women look thrilled. They're bringing up their little babies to get pat on the head by the German soldiers. It's cute. Anyhow, beyond the moral and legal issues was that of national security. As mentioned, the Germans had discovered documents in Vienna and Prague revealing a covert policy of the British Foreign Office to weaken Germany. Chamberlain's arbitration of the 1938 Sudetenland crisis had satisfied Hitler's demands, but also had rescued Czechoslovakia at the time. Britain and France had not been equipped to wage war to defend this small but useful ally. Once Czechoslovakia collapsed in March 1939, the Anglo-French lost an integral component of their, quote, "selective security," unquote, alliance system. London's public guarantee of Poland followed immediately. Hitler surmised that Chamberlain's purpose for this declaration was to turn Poland against Germany to replace one hostile state on the Reich's eastern front with another. The Führer told his architect Hermann Giesler that he believed that the coalition forming against Germany wanted war. Quote, "I must strive to prevent the encirclement of Germany and punch through it regardless of which direction." End quote. On August 9, 1939, Henderson had written Undersecretary Cadogan in London that both the Germans and the Italians believed that Poland would attempt to settle the dispute with the Reich by force that year, before British support becomes lukewarm. In Warsaw, army commanders and certain Polish politicians recommended challenging Germany soon, since the cost of indefinitely maintaining so many soldiers on active duty was too great a strain on the national budget. The general mobilization Poland announced on August 30th was another ominous sign for Hitler. Feeling threatened both to the east and to the west, he opted to strike first. One could perhaps judge his decision in the spirit of a maxim of Prussia's 18th century monarch Friedrich the Great. He declared that in war, the real aggressor is he who forces the enemy to fire the first shot. And that is the end of Chapter 3. I'm going to end my offline recording here. Thank you for joining me for what was the end of Chapter 3 of Hitler's Revolution with commentary by Tador. Tador's Hitler's Revolution with commentary by me, Patrick Little. I hope you enjoyed this. This is a book that doesn't have an audio narration yet. We're on Chapter 4. We are just about halfway through the book, and you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff that will really open your eyes to true history later on in this book. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to doing this again real soon. Have a good night, Goyim.